Hey crew, here we are. We're at the beginning of our second Joint Humanities unit, this one on civics. This is our first of about 5, maybe 6 presentations. Let's get to it. We have a lot to talk about. All right. I would like to talk about the essential questions for the unit. One of our questions includes a few confusing terms, so it's important to establish what these terms are and what they mean. And then the last piece is looking at the founding documents and the historical context that gave rise to these documents. So there are 3 documents, maybe 3.5, and I'll talk about that. But, as these documents really do inform how we, our livelihoods in this nation, as well as how we engage and how we attempt to create positive change. These are very important today. And at the same time, we really have to figure out where these documents came from. What were the reasons by which they emerged, and how did they emerge? And we're going to look at that in this screencast, as well as in the next one. We're going to entertain some of these notions as well. Okay, let's keep moving. First question, what is civic power and how do we access it? We have already begun discussing this, right? We looked at Eric Liu's short video on power, particularly the different sources of power and the laws of power. This presentation today isn't explicitly discussing power. That said, I encourage you, as we look at different figures and different things that happen, I encourage you to consider which sources and laws of power are at play. Don't abandon that concept or idea, because it's going to be important throughout the unit. Okay, how do we use our power to create change in a federal republic? And this is where we need to parse some perhaps familiar but tricky words, and those being federal and republic. Before I do that, though, I'm going to entertain a little bit of a rabbit trail here. Cesar Chavez is not just an ornament for this slide, but hopefully a point of instruction for all of us. Hopefully you've heard the name. Hopefully you know even a little more about Cesar Chavez, but just breaking it down. An important American born in Yuma, Arizona. He sadly dropped out of school in the 8th grade, and in the context of the Depression, the Great Depression, and needed to move up to California. California would become his political theater. In actuality, the whole nation would become his political theater, but the emergence of Cesar Chavez as a political activist really happened in California, in particular with the farm workers, all right? And he actually founded what would become the United Farm Workers of America, which is a large labor organization of American farm workers. He is really in the train of Gandhi, Martin Luther King, right? Individuals who, when you, again, considering sources of power, didn't go the line of physical violence, all right? But nonviolent protests, and among other things, really did create better wages and work environments for farm workers in California and ultimately around the nation. There's still work to be done there. Let's not fail to note that. His wife, Helen, often goes unnoted, but a partner in his activism, while Cesar Chavez was working with largely male farm workers. His wife, Helen, was addressing the problems of farm workers on the domestic side, right? Women, largely women, and families, right? After Cesar Chavez's death, President Clinton actually awarded him a Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest award that can be given to a citizen. And that's bittersweet because on the one hand, it's great he received that. On the other hand, it gets exhausting when you have really awesome individuals, largely people of color, who get awards after their deaths. It shouldn't have happened, and at the same time, it is good that he was recognized for this. And, by the way, talking about ways by which you promote power, access power, get power, Cesar Chavez had this really great slogan, which was "Si se puede," which Obama would ultimately pick up and say, "Yes, we can." All right. So Obama was really drawing from Cesar Chavez as far as political slogans go. All right. Little rabbit trail. I'm going to take a few of these, all right, because they are important. All right, let's talk about our terms. Confusing terms. A republic, first of all. A republic is a system of government that in which citizens elect or put into office the people who represent them, the politicians. Okay, that is a republic. Other systems of government might be more appointees, right? And these are more authoritarian governments. In a republic, the citizens and the people vote for those with whom they would want to represent them. All right, so the U.S. is a republic. Let's look at these three terms that are all very similar and all very different. All right, first of all, federal. Federal, when you see that word, it refers to national, okay? The federal government is the national government. When we talk about the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI, that is a national police force, all right? It's not the state, it's not the county, it's not the city, okay? It's national. So federal means national, all right? Federalism, okay, this is different. Federalism is a type of government that has different spheres of government. All right. Well, what do I mean by that? We have national laws. We have state laws. We even have little city municipalities. I wish my city banned gas-powered leaf blowers. They don't. Some cities do. So there are different laws depending on different tiers of activity. And again, some cities have different laws. Different states have different laws, right? Marijuana is not legal nationally, right? There are different states that either legalize it or not. All right, so that's what federalism is. It's that notion that there are different spheres of government, the hope here is that the different spheres of government or tiers of government work together, right? And when you are able to have different state laws, it really gives you less of a blunt tool, a more precise tool to really address what the needs are for your citizens in that state or in that city, right? So that's some value of federalism. And ultimately, the two work together toward accomplishing big problems, COVID being one of them, right? The different ways by which state works with the federal government to execute testing or responses to illness, all that business. Okay, federalism. Finally, federalist. This is a historic term. This is referring to a person, pretty much we're talking about 18th century individuals, or at least in this context of this presentation. A federalist is a person who is in support of big government, strong centralized government. So, for instance, a federalist, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, all right? These individuals wanted a very, very secure and firm central government. So, for instance, some Federalists wanted to elect a president for life. Okay, that's pretty strong government. That's when we look back and look at that, it really looks a little bit like authoritarianism, right? But this idea that one leader would be elected, but then serve in perpetuity would be something that Federalists could get behind. This idea of a strong central government. All right. Anti-Federalists are those that, contrary to this position, wanted a weaker central government. They wanted stronger local governments, right? Whether that's state, colony, right? To sort of avoid the problems that are happening with the sort of strength and power of the British Empire, and recognizing that an American government as well could lean in that direction of authoritarianism if central powers had too much power, right? So a Federalist, strong central authority. Anti-Federalists want something not quite as strong, maybe a 2-year term, right? And ultimately what you get is a compromise in the Constitution. That'll be our next presentation. We'll talk about constitutional compromises. Okay, Federalist. And here we have another really important American, Yuri Kochiyama. Again, I hope you've heard of this really important person. Born in 1921 in California. After Pearl Harbor, being a Japanese American, with the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, as you're aware, there was a profound change in attitude against Japanese people in the United States. And Yuri Kochiyama was a victim of this, right? A victim maybe isn't the right language. I don't think she'd call herself a victim at all. She's a tremendously strong woman who sadly passed away a few years ago. But Yuri Kochiyama, after Pearl Harbor, her father was actually just recovering from a surgery, and in the hospital they put a sheet around around his bed that said "prisoner of war." He ultimately would die, and you wonder what a young Yuri Kochiyama would think about that if her father got the proper treatment. Just sort of a really ignoble and sad death. Subsequently, she would be sent across the country to Arkansas at a Japanese American detention camp. Ultimately, she would marry another second generation Japanese American and live in New York. And she would become an activist. She aligned herself with Malcolm X, whom she was a good friend with, and she started a group, among other groups, called the Asian Alliance for Action, and they worked very closely with the Black Liberation Movement in order to create positive change in the 60s and 70s in particular, we're talking about. She would actually be at Malcolm X's death when he was shot and killed, and indeed there's a very famous picture of Yuri Kochiyama holding Malcolm X, his head, as he died in her arms, really. So this is just a tremendously important creator of positive change, Yuri Kochiyama, that we should celebrate. And just thinking about what she did and what people have noted about her that they've really appreciated from her. This idea of not just bringing people together, which I think we've all heard, but aligning movements and creating positive change through looking at the intersection of her interests with other people's interests as really a vehicle, an important vehicle of power, right? Numbers. Okay. All right, another question. What are the founding documents and what events led up to the Constitutional Convention? We're going to look at that right now. Before I do, and I'll try to be brief, the Gang of Four. Again, hopefully you know these people. These are really the four standout activists from the 60s, starting in the 60s in Seattle. Here we have an awesome picture of Bob Santos, Filipino-American. The other three, Robert Maestas, Bernie Whitebear, Larry Gossett. Larry Gossett is still alive. Sadly, the other three have passed away. But they looked at all these problems in Seattle that they continue to exist today. Housing, healthcare, education, employment. Here, Bob Santos is in the International District. You see the sign in the back, Humbaos, not hot dogs. They are protesting the building of the Kingdom, which happened 75, 76. Because it was creating a mess in the ID. So there you have that really, I think, creative and cool political slogan, Humbaos, not hot dogs, which really they gathered behind. All right, let's go on to what we're doing here. Here are our three documents. We have Declaration of Independence. This is, I have a little icon of a king with an X through it. Essentially, this is the breakup with the British Crown, the issuing that statement. We the people, here we have the Constitution. These are the structures of government. After you break up, you sort of install a new system. But when you get new systems, again, as I mentioned, anti-federalist concerns, you want to make sure that you are able to maintain certain rights. And what you get there are the Bill of Rights. You have 10 amendments. Now we have 27 amendments. They've been listed. But the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments. All right. Again, I mentioned this is a breakup. By the way, this was a really delicious little rabbit trail that I entertained, which was Google imaging breakup texts. They're so funny. Okay, but I'm breaking up with you. What? I'm sorry. It's just that I don't feel the same way about you anymore. I think you have the wrong number. Oh, wow. I'm sorry. How awkward. LOL. But do you think that's a bad way to tell them? Yes, that's the answer. Although I think we can all agree that we're getting some joy from reading it. Okay, so the utilitarian might suggest that the overall net pleasure is great. All right, whatever. Here we go. Constitution. These are new rules. Okay, I had to go there. New rules. So Declaration of Independence, breakup text. I don't know. I think there are so many great breakup songs. I guess I could have done one of those. Thank you next. I don't know. There's not really any thank yous in the Declaration of Independence, to be clear, though. All right. Constitution, new rules, new system of government. So what do we have for Bill of Rights? Oh, another really important woman performer. Her name is Leslie Gore. Perhaps you don't know her, but she sings that anthem, "You Don't Know Me," right? Who did that? Jeezy and someone had like a remake, right? But whatever. We're going with the original Leslie Gore. You Don't Know Me. That's the Bill of Rights. All right. So I am not going to be hurt again. Therefore, I have some things that I require, and that is the Bill of Rights. Okay. Let's keep moving. Founding documents. We're getting into the contextualization of our documents. All right. These are our documents. All right. 1776, 89, 91. Declaration, Constitution, Bill of Rights. I did say there are 3.5. All right. So let's look for the other half. These other little stars are not arbitrarily assigned, these actually also represent really important dates. So we're going to take you through these little star dates as we contextualize these really important documents. Let's go. Not a really, I don't love this picture. It's a little bit blurry, but again, we're not really wanting to read this. We're wanting to look at the patterns of pink. So what we have here is a map of the British Empire in about 1750. Okay, that's the closest I could really find. And you can see that the British Empire is great. All right, here's Britain. Okay. And look at just how much territory there is. It is remarkable. So this is important because when we talk about the U.S., what will be the U.S., 13 colonies, when we think about these colonies, and we talk about them as colonies of the British Empire, we can't fail to acknowledge that this is small, right? And when you hear the Crown talking about the insignificant 13 colonies, you begin to be able to unpack, okay, I kind of get it, right? Let's just look at how much there is. So, important to note. So, when we talk about real, what were the real moments? The fact that a number of British citizens left Britain in order to establish themselves in another country already indicates a level of antagonism, right? Or a sense of wanting to go somewhere else for whatever reasons. All right. The traditional reason that is often given is religious freedom, and that's perhaps a part of the story. It is not the complete story by any means. So already some antagonism that exists between the colonies and Britain, but when it really got escalated was the Stamp Act. And again, probably heard of this, but this is a tax that was put on paperwork. So not just paperwork, but really also anything that requires paper. So there's sort of both ends of that. But so paper products, paperwork was really important, especially as you far away from your country in which you still identify citizenship and you attempt to execute different sorts of important legal things. You have to do paperwork. We all do paperwork. And this was a tax that was put on the 13 colonies. Okay? It was put on the 13 colonies, not all of the colonies. Look at all the colonies once again. So you can begin to understand maybe this would have been able to be a little more manageable if you're like, okay, the British Empire put this stamp tax on all colonies. No, it was targeted to these 13 colonies in the Americas here. Okay? So that was upsetting, all right? And really the start of really working toward and reconsidering the future of this nation as the other colonies are an independent nation. All right, Stamp Act is really important. Okay, 5 years later, here's an event, Boston Massacre. No doubt, again, you're familiar with this. Well, what do we have here in the Boston Massacre? We have, at this time, Boston is about 16 to 20,000 inhabitants, so it is smaller, yet also urban, clearly. There's a mythology about this event, right? Who fired the first shot? Was it accidental? Was it intentional by a soldier? Did an officer actually give a command? This little piece of propaganda would indicate that there was a command, right? And people shot. 5 people did die in this incident. It was probably started out by colonists pelting snowballs at British officers. Is there some, we're not interested in monoc causes here. There was antagonism on both sides, But ultimately what we have here are people with guns who shot and killed 5 individuals. Okay. One of these individuals is absolutely important to note. Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks is an American of mixed race. Okay. His father was an enslaved African. His mother was indigenous from the tribe of Wampanoag, or Wampanoag. I think it's called Wampanoag, actually. It's Wampanoag, Wampanoag, which represents sort of a loose coalition of a number of other tribes as well. So Wampanoag and enslaved African, he actually ran away and successfully from enslavement. And notice was put actually in the paper for him, so we know that he was 6'2", so he was a rather large, tall individual as well. He ran away from slavery. He became a sailor, actually, going, I think, even as far as the Bahamas. So there's some information with respect to that. He was caught up in the activities, and he was actually pretty vocal against British imperial powers. There's actually a story about the night before in a pub, how he a pub in Boston, how he essentially ran a loyalist out of the bar, which is a person who is from the colonies yet supportive of the crown. There was a story about that. Is that true? Is that false? I don't know. But nevertheless, a strong individual, certainly strong. He ran away from slavery, stayed away from slavery, and became a professional sailor. It's a pretty big deal. When he died, it was regarded at that time as the largest, when he was killed, it was regarded as the largest memorial that had ever happened in the city of Boston up to that time, with over 2,000 people present. So an important individual, and regarded as the first casualty of the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War won't exactly start for another 5 years, but if you consider Revolutionary War as sort of a series of antagonisms and conflicts that exist, I think it is fair to note him as that. Another really important thing that I hope we get from this, a sad reality of today, it's this, because John Adams, our second president, would actually ultimately blame the whole riot on Crispus Attucks. Again, the only person of color who was in the conflict and a victim of the conflict. He died, a casualty of the conflict. John Adams essentially blamed it on him as being an antagonizer that riled people up and started the conflict. So that is one narrative, and it's a narrative that I think is incomplete and problematic. And it really brings us to the beginning of these narratives of people of color, very often black males, and I would say even he's 6'2", large black males, okay, as being identified as instigators, problem makers, which is very sadly a narrative that our country still hasn't been able to dismantle. So Crispus Attucks, please remember this gentleman's name. All right. We are off to another, we talked about the Stamp Act, we talked about the Boston Massacre. Here we are in our third little star here. We have the Boston Tea Party. And I'm sure you've heard of this as well. Here you have this anti-federalist group. They're called the Sons of Liberty. Sounds like a motorcycle gang. It is not. You probably recognize some people that are a part of this group. Sam Adams, all right, there's the beer, right, but there's more than that. Patrick Henry, right, give me liberty or give me death. Paul Revere, the British are coming on their, riding up and down on his horse. And also Benedict Arnold, probably the most notorious traitor in the history of our country, right? So, Sons of Liberty, they went aboard a ship, dumped 342 chests of tea into the water, which George Washington would ultimately call a great waste of tea. And this is, and you might be like looking at this and thinking, okay, I don't see any, I just see a bunch of indigenous peoples. Well, these fools dressed up in American Indian dress so as to sort of hide their identities. And again, another activity in the sort of train of Crispus Attucks in which you blame activities on people of color, and in this case, indigenous peoples. All right, indigenous peoples did not dump the tea. The Sons of Liberty did, right? This anti-federalist group. 342 chests, to be precise. All right. Oh, and here we have the Boston Three-Party. Little NBA history. This is really the beginning of the modern super team. All right. Before Bosh, Wade, and LeBron, it was Allen, Garnett, Paul Pierce. All right. And they called them the Boston Three-Party, among other things. I thought that was a good name, though. Okay. So, the NBA today, who do we have to blame? That's right. That said, I kind of am rooting for the Celtics. I'm absolutely rooting for the Celtics over the Nets. If anyone is rooting for the Nets, come see me. Not cool. All right. The responses from the British government were swift and severe. All right. We have the intolerable acts, named so because they are intolerable. Well, what are they? You have the Boston Port Bill. This is the first one, or the Boston Port Act. This is the first one that says you need to pay us back for all that tea. Dang it. What else we have? A Quartering Act. Quartering Act, you'll actually see it a little later on in the Bill of Rights, but the Quartering Act is the passage of a bill that would allow British troops to stay in your house, eat your food, do whatever they need to provide for themselves. It's certainly also a great mechanism of surveillance if you have British authorities inside your house. Well, what else happened? You had all the grievances. The courts were moved to Britain. So if you had a grievance or a concern and you wanted to take it to court, you had to go all the way from the colonies to Britain. And once you get to Britain, do you really think a colonist is going to get a fair trial? Right? So really, and you're going to see this later on in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the importance of fair trials. Okay. And then also, what else did they do? They could no longer, the colonists could no longer, it was no longer a republic. They could no longer vote their peoples into office. They needed to, well, I probably shouldn't call it a republic, but consistent with a republic, they could vote their own peoples into office. Now the British Crown was appointing their political leaders. Okay, so these are the intolerable acts, and we're at 1774 now, and that is just the last straw. Oh, I forgot to do this. I was going to use that for my Boston Tea Party. Dang it, missed opportunity. I'll remember from my in-person presentation. All right, next. Okay, the Revolutionary War has indeed started. All right, you're familiar with the battles of Lexington and Concord, 1775. The war officially would go through 1783, and now we have all sorts of things that are happening in the context of this aggression, including the emergence of a document called the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation would be an early attempt. I should talk about the Declaration of Independence first, but did I not? Okay. Well, I will talk about the Articles of Confederation. Is sort of a precursor to the Constitution. And what it did was it laid out, well, we have the Declaration, the breakup, then the Articles, it really laid out what the structure of government looked like. It discussed how the colonies were now united. It identified a Congress or a body of legislators who were both elected, and then also it was a body that could collectively create change as a unified body rather than 13 different colonies. It established routes to make treaties. So it was that first real attempt at identifying what this unit, this collection, this unified nation looks like, right? But there were problems with this, all right? And what do we see? Shays' Rebellion really exposed, and now we're in 1786, all right? So we are now a couple years after the Revolutionary War. So under the Articles of Confederation, this is that document, again, that sort of identifies, it's essentially their constitution at this time, but it was weak. So how do we see its weakness in the context of Shays' Rebellion? Well, let's start out with who this individual is. Daniel Shays, he's a retired Revolutionary soldier. Among his engagement in the Revolution, including Bunker Hill, participation at Bunker Hill, which is also a popular, a well-known Revolutionary battle. And he became a farmer. And Daniel Shays had enough. He was upset, on the one hand, with the compensation from the government following his service as a soldier. And he was also really upset at the level of taxation that was applied toward farmers. All right, so it was really a double blow for him, and he was feeling the brunt of both. So he got 600 people together, and the rebellion is actually a series of protests and rebellions. It does culminate in one activity, but we should understand this as sort of a sequence of events in 1786. He got 600 ex-soldiers and farmers, largely, other people as well who are discontent, joining in. But they would stage protests at courthouses, largely around taxation for farmers, but then also for the treatment and poor compensation for those who protected the nation from the British, right? This also escalated, and there was nothing coming as a result. So looking at our little power and how they lean on power, the peaceful protest piece wasn't really working. So they took what is now 1,200 people and they stormed the arsenal. And that is definitely a tried and true method for revolutionaries. Get a band of people together and storm and try to take over the place that has all the weapons, right? Alas, they were not successful in this. Well, what ultimately came out of this, and why is Shays' Rebellion important? Well, the colonies recognized that they needed an army. Okay, they needed a professional army that they could sort of dispense when problems like this arose, and arose quickly. Okay, at this time there is no professional army. There are people that are professionals that go into service in protection of the country, much like in the Revolutionary War. There are no professional armies. So what is the lesson from Shays' Rebellion? We need a professional army. Okay, how do we get a professional army? This also exposes another problem of the Articles of Confederation. There was no mechanism for taxation. Okay, the colonies could not get monies from the peoples that they could allocate toward a professional army. Okay, so what do we learn? We need to tax. We need clear paths for taxing people and the establishment of a professional army. And I do think it is very interesting that the recognition of the need for a professional army did not happen in the context of the American Revolution or battling a foreign country. The recognition that we need a permanent standing professional army happened in order to put down domestic disputes. It's a scary thing in my mind to come to terms with, right? That's what led to the professional army, right? Yeah, something to chew on there. But a very important event, which will ultimately, as we expose the problems of the Articles of Confederation, it'll lead to the Constitutional Convention. And this is the assemblage of people, I'll talk more about this in the next screencast, that came together from different colonies. One did not show up. Stay tuned for which one didn't for the next presentation. To put together a new structure, right? Dua Lipa new rules. What are the new structures that we are going to put together in order to reimagine what our country looks like, in order to keep it quote unquote safe, efficient, autonomous, right? And here we have Governor Morris, an interesting lad. Certainly you see the peg leg, which is, I guess, pretty charismatic. Actually, probably the most prolific speaker at the Constitutional Convention, even though not a whole lot of people know who he is, but he's an interesting person. He was single. He didn't marry till he was about 60, and I think he married his housekeeper. Maybe some concerns around that. But his brother was a British general. His sisters were loyalists. So again, these are individuals that are colonists, though sympathetic to Britain and not wanting to separate from Britain. And he's, one of the framers of our Constitution. So a pretty big gap in political views there. He would also sadly die on account of a surgery that he attempted to conduct by himself, on himself, including a whalebone. All right. Another ignoble end to a noble human. I'm going to... Actually, I think that's my last slide, but yeah. So I do want to note here that we have the convention in 1787. The Constitution will ultimately be ratified in 1789. That is approved, right? So it is a process. And then finally, you have the Bill of Rights, which again is that document of the first 10 amendments that say, yes, I recognize that this new structure exists, yet I want freedom of speech, right? Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, right? Third Amendment, I believe, is the one around quartering. I don't want any more British troops in my house, right? Fourth Amendment, search and seizure. So there are 10 really important rights that we'll look at next. I think it is part of your homework. Okay. Let's close shop. Thank you. Appreciate your attentions. If you have questions about this as you are filling out your chart, please let me know. All right.